Gray Mallister had woken up to a lot of things in his 42 years. He'd woken up to cannon fire that shook the very ground at Antietam. He'd woken up to the sound of thunder rolling across the plains like a great beast clearing its throat. He'd even woken up to the high, thin screams of men who knew they were seeing their last sunrise. But he had never, not once, woken up to the kiss of an obsidian blade pressed against his throat. The knife was a piece of the night sky, polished and sharp, catching the moonlight that sliced through the cabin's single dusty window. It was cold, it was sharp, and it was as patient as the grave. Above him, a figure knelt. She was like a shadow given form, an angel of vengeance come down from the high, cold mountains. Her breathing was a shallow whisper in the frigid air. Long black hair, a river of darkness, spilled over her bare shoulders, framing a face he had seen every time he closed his eyes for the last 8 months. He knew those eyes. They were as black as a desert night, and they had been haunting his dreams since the day he'd made her a widow. It was Ayanna, the wife of the Apache warrior he'd shot down. "Do you remember me?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the cabin sharper than any knife. Her English was perfect, each word a carefully honed weapon. "The woman you made a widow at Skeleton Canyon." Gray felt the volcanic glass bite into his skin. A thin line of blood, warm and sudden, bloomed against the weathered leather of his neck. He could have moved. He could have grabbed the Colt that was always on his nightstand, within arm's reach. He was bigger than her, stronger. He could have thrown her off, turned the tables in a heartbeat. He could have done 100 different things. Instead, he lay as still as the stone formations out in the desert. "I remember," he said, his voice a low rumble of rust and whiskey. "Been wondering when you'd finally come." Something flickered in those midnight eyes. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It looked like surprise, maybe even disappointment. The obsidian blade trembled, just for a second, a tiny tremor against his pulse. He had been waiting. He had been expecting her. This wasn't the start of a fight. It was the end of a long, lonely vigil. "You've been waiting for me," she whispered, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "Every single night since you put my husband in the ground." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an admission of a truth that had lived between them, unspoken, for months. Outside, the Arizona wind screamed through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound that rattled the bones of the old cabin. Inside, there was only the sound of their breathing, hers quick and tight, his deep and slow and utterly resigned. She had played this moment over and over in her mind 1,000 times. She had pictured him begging, fighting, pleading for his life. She had imagined the fear in his eyes as she brought the justice her husband Nailish deserved. But Gray Mallister wasn't afraid. He lay beneath her blade like a man who had already made his peace with God, or the devil, or whatever came next. He looked like a man welcoming the end. And that somehow made everything 1,000 times harder. The knife wavered in her grip. Her hand loosened, just for an instant. But it was long enough. Long enough for him to see the single tear she'd been holding back, trace a silver path down her bronze cheek in the pale moonlight. What kind of monster was this? Who didn't flinch from death? What kind of enemy welcomed his own executioner with such weary acceptance? And what in the hell was she supposed to do with a man who looked even more broken than she felt? "Get up," she commanded, her voice suddenly sharp as cracked ice. "Slowly." Gray moved with the deliberate, careful grace of a man who knew any sudden motion could be his last. He rose from the narrow cot, his hands held out where she could see them. The old floorboards groaned under his bare feet as he stood. She backed away from him, moving toward the small table in the center of the room, but the obsidian blade never left his chest. It was an extension of her arm, a finger of judgment pointed directly at his heart. Her buckskin dress, simple and worn, clung to a frame that was lean and strong, the kind of strength forged in hardship, the kind of power that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. "Sit," she said, gesturing with her chin toward the single wooden chair by the cold, dark fireplace. He did as he was told, sinking into the chair without a word of protest. He looked like a man at his own sentencing, waiting for the verdict to be read. The embers in the hearth had died hours ago, leaving nothing but cold ash. The only light was the silver spill of the moon, painting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. But Gray's eyes had long since adjusted to the dark. He could see her perfectly. He saw the proud, defiant tilt of her chin. He saw the way her free hand, the one not holding the knife, trembled almost imperceptibly at her side. She was not as calm as she wanted him to believe. Why? The question slipped out of her before she could stop it. It was a crack in her armor of vengeance. Why aren't you afraid? Gray's weathered face was a mask of stone in the dim light. Should I be? I could end your life right now. Right here. Yes, he said. His tone wasn't a challenge. It wasn't mocking. It was simple, plain fact. You could. The raw honesty of it hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had spent weeks tracking him, moving like a ghost through the Arizona wilderness, following the trail of a man who lived like a hermit, a phantom on the very edge of the civilized world. She had come here expecting to find a beast, a soulless killer who had gunned down her husband without a second thought. She had come to kill a monster. Instead, she had found something far, far worse. She'd found a man who looked just as hollowed out by the world as she was. You killed my husband, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Nalish. He was the bravest warrior of our people. A great man. Gray's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue like a winter sky, met hers and didn't flinch. Yes. The simple, unadorned word was another blow. No excuses, no justification. Just, yes. He was everything to me, she choked out. I know. Then why? The knife shook in her hand now, the trembling more pronounced. Why did you have to kill him? For the first time, a flicker of something new crossed Gray's face. Not fear, not regret, something deeper, something complicated. He looked past her, toward the dark window, as if seeing a ghost in the glass. Because he was trying to kill Lieutenant Morrison, Gray said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Your husband was a warrior. He knew the risks of battle. Same as I did. Iyana's breath hitched in her throat. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, and in none of her visions had the killer of her husband spoken his name with anything but contempt. She had expected slurs, justifications, the casual racism of a soldier. She had never, ever expected him to speak of Nalish with a soldier's respect. It threw her completely off balance. He fought like a man possessed that day, Gray continued, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. Took 3 of my bullets before he finally went down. I've never seen courage like that. Not in the whole damn war. The obsidian knife clattered onto the wooden table. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a sob, a raw, broken sound that echoed in the crushing silence of the cabin. She had come for vengeance, but he was giving her tribute. Don't, she gasped, her voice cracking under the weight of it. Don't you dare speak of him, not like you knew him. I didn't know him, Gray said, his pale eyes finding hers again. But I knew men like him. Good men, fighting for what they believed in, on both sides of the line. He leaned forward just a fraction, his voice dropping even lower, so gentle it was almost a caress. Just like I was. She just stared at him, this impossible man, this enemy who spoke of her husband with reverence, this killer who faced his own death with the same quiet dignity that Nalish had shown in his final moments. This should have been simple. This should have made killing him easy, a clean act of justice. Instead, it twisted everything into a knot she couldn't begin to untangle. Then he did something that shattered her world completely. You want a drink? He nodded toward a dark bottle of whiskey sitting on a rough wooden shelf. Before you decide what happens next. Ayanna swiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the dust and tears on her skin. Why would you offer me whiskey? Because, Gray said, his voice as tired as the ancient mountains outside. You look like you need it just as much as I do. She watched, stunned into silence as he slowly rose from the chair. He moved to the shelf with that same deliberate slowness, the careful grace of a man who had spent a lifetime telegraphing his movements to men with nervous fingers on triggers. He was making it clear he was no threat. The whiskey gurgled into two battered tin cups, the amber liquid catching the moonlight like trapped fire. He set one of the cups on the table, right next to her hand, close enough that she could reach it without moving far from the obsidian blade. It was a gesture of profound understanding. He knew she still needed her weapon close. He knew she was a grieving woman, a cornered animal, and he was giving her space. He raised his own cup in a silent toast. "To your husband," Gray said, his voice clear and steady. "May he find better hunting grounds than these?" The words were an Apache blessing, spoken in perfect pronunciation, spoken by the man who killed him. The sentiment, so pure and unexpected, broke something deep inside her chest. A wall she had been building for 8 months, stone by painful stone, suddenly crumbled into dust. Her hand, shaking, reached for the tin cup. The whiskey burned a path down her throat, a welcome fire in the cold emptiness of her soul. "How?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "How do you know our words?" "Learned some Apache during the campaigns," he said, taking a slow sip from his own cup. "Figured if I was going to fight a man, I should at least know how to show him proper respect when he fell." Another crack in the fortress around her heart. This was supposed to be simple revenge. Clean. Justice served cold under a winter moon. But nothing about Gray Mallister was simple. Nothing about this night was clean. "You're not what I expected," she admitted, the words escaping her before she could stop them. "What did you expect?" "A monster." She drained the rest of the whiskey in one gulp, the familiar burn a small comfort. "Someone I could kill without a second thought." A sad, humorless smile touched Gray's lips. "Sorry to disappoint." Just then, the wind outside picked up, slamming against the cabin with a sudden, violent fury. It rattled the shutters and sent icy drafts snaking through the gaps in the log walls. The small room suddenly felt even smaller, more intimate. The world outside had disappeared, leaving just two broken souls sharing whiskey in a heavy silence in the middle of a vast, uncaring wilderness. Two enemies who were quickly becoming something else entirely, something she had no name for. "Tell me about him," Gray said, and the request caught her completely off guard. "Your husband. What was he like? When he wasn't fighting soldiers?" The question hung in the air between them, thick as smoke. Ayanna stared down into her empty cup, but she wasn't seeing the battered tin. She was seeing memories. She was seeing a life that had been stolen from her. "He laughed," she said, her voice soft as a prayer. "Knowledge. He had this laugh that could fill our whole lodge. It was big and loud and full of life. The children, they loved him for it. They would follow him everywhere just to hear it." She found herself standing, moving to the window without even realizing it. She moved with the fluid grace of a hunter, a woman accustomed to silence and shadows. The moonlight carved her profile in silver, tracing the proud line of her nose, the curve of her lips that had once smiled so easily. "He taught me to speak your language," she said, her voice distant, lost in the past. "He said that knowing an enemy's words was the first step to understanding their heart." She turned from the window to face Gray again, and he felt his own breath catch in his chest at the raw, bottomless pain in her eyes. "Ironic, isn't it?" "Not ironic," Gray said softly. "Wise." He poured more whiskey into her cup, then his own. The silence stretched between them again, taut as a bowstring. "My Sarah, she used to say the same thing about the Apache. Said if more folks on our side tried to understand instead of just fight, maybe there'd be fewer graves to dig on both sides." "Sarah, my wife." The words came out of him rough as sandpaper. "Fever took her, and our boy, Sammy, 3 years back, right before I signed on and headed west." Ayanna's hand, as if with a mind of its own, drifted back to the obsidian blade on the table. Her fingers traced its sharp edge. "So you understand loss." "I understand running from it," he corrected her, his voice hollow. There was a darkness in his tone that made her look closer, really look at the man sitting across from her. Gray Mallister wasn't just a soldier. He was a man hunched under the weight of an invisible mountain, the kind of weight that never gets lighter, no matter how many miles you travel or how much whiskey you pour down your throat. "Is that why you came to Apache country? Running?" Running, he confirmed, his pale eyes meeting hers across the small room. And a need to forget. He gave a short, bitter laugh. Funny thing, though. A man can travel 1,000 miles, cross rivers and mountains, and still find himself trapped in the exact same hell he was trying to escape. He wasn't just talking about his wife and son anymore. She knew it. He was talking about something else. Something that had happened out here. Something that had broken him in a way the war, or even his family's death, never had. He was about to say more. She could see it in his eyes, the confession rising to his lips. But the wind chose that exact moment to slam against the cabin again, a furious, physical blow. They both flinched, turning toward the sound. But this time, it wasn't just the wind. Riding beneath the howl of the winter storm, there was another sound. A rhythmic, urgent drumming. Hoofbeats, coming fast. And they were coming right for the cabin. Gray was on his feet before the sound even fully registered in her mind. All the weariness, all the resignation, vanished in an instant. He was a soldier again. His hand moved without thought, reaching for the worn gun belt hanging from a peg on the wall. "Company," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Nobody good," he added, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line outside the window. "Not this time of night, not in this weather." He strapped the Colt around his waist with the practiced, efficient motions of a man who had done it 1,000 times. His gaze snapped to the Winchester rifle mounted over the door, then to her. "You know how to use one of those?" Ayanna stared at him, bewildered by the sudden shift. One minute he was her confessor, the next her commander. "You're asking me, the woman who came here to kill you, to arm herself." "Those riders aren't coming for a friendly chat," he said, his voice hard as iron. "And whatever sins are between you and me, I won't stand by and watch a woman get hurt on my watch. Not by them." The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. She could distinguish them now. At least 4 horses, maybe more, moving at a hard gallop through the snow-dusted pines. Through the grimy window, she saw it too. The flickering, dancing lights of torches weaving through the trees, casting long, monstrous shadows that writhed across the snow. Gray didn't wait for her answer. He grabbed the rifle from its pegs and tossed it to her. She caught it out of the air, the cold, heavy steel familiar in her hands. She handled the weapon with the easy confidence of someone who had learned to shoot long before she had learned to read. "Who are they?" she asked, her own voice low and steady now, the earlier turmoil replaced by a cold, sharp focus. "Deserters, most likely," Gray said, moving to the window, pressing his back flat against the log wall beside it. "Or worse, claimed jumpers. There's a crew of them, been hitting ranches up and down this valley for the last month." He peered through a crack in the shutters. "They must have seen the smoke from the chimney. Figured there's something in here worth taking." A cold dread trickled down Ayanna's spine, colder than the winter night. "What do they usually take?" Gray's jaw tightened into a hard knot. "Whatever they can get their hands on." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air between them. They took supplies, they took money, and they took people. The implication hit her like a physical blow. She had come here tonight prepared to die, prepared to kill. But the thought of what those men would do to her, the thought of being taken, used, and discarded like so much trash, it sent a spike of pure ice through her veins. A fate far, far worse than a clean death. "How many bullets?" she asked, her fingers expertly checking the Winchester's chamber. "Enough," he said. "You any good with that thing?" Ayanna didn't answer with words. She worked the lever action, the smooth metallic schlick-schlack of the mechanism echoing in the tense silence. It was a sound that sharpened the air, a promise of violence. "Knowledge taught me well." Just then, the first rider broke through the tree line. He was a big scarred man with a wild tangle of hair and even wilder eyes. He pulled his horse to a halt just beyond the weak circle of light from the cabin window. Behind him, 3 others emerged from the darkness, their faces hard and cruel in the flickering torchlight. All of them were heavily armed. They looked like wolves who had scented blood. "Mallister!" the leader's voice boomed, cutting through the wind. "We know you're in there. We saw your smoke. Come on out, nice and peaceful like, and maybe we'll make this quick for you." Gray spat into the cold fireplace, his disgust clear. "Like hell." "What do you want?" he shouted back, his voice rough. Heard you struck a little silver up the canyon, old man, the leader yelled, a greedy smile spreading across his bearded face. Figure you owe the community a share. Heard wrong. There's nothing here for you. Maybe, the man chuckled, a nasty grating sound. But we'll be the judge of that. We're going to come in and take a look around anyway, and we'll be taking whatever else you got in there that looks interesting. The leader's eyes scanned the front of the cabin, and then they locked onto the window. Ayana saw his expression shift, his eyes widening slightly as he spotted her movement inside. The greedy smile turned into a cold, predatory leer. Well, 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 he drawled, turning to his companions. Looks like the old soldier's got himself some company, boys. An Indian girl from the look of her. He let out a low whistle. Boys, I do believe this night just got a whole lot more interesting. The casual, brutal objectification in his voice sent a hot surge of pure rage burning through Ayana's chest. She had faced down death. She had endured loss and heartbreak that would have shattered a lesser person, but she could not endure the fate these men had in mind for her. She would die first, and she would take them with her. Is there a back window? She asked Gray, her voice dangerously calm. There is. Leads out over the canyon, but it's a 30-foot drop onto solid rock. Better than what they're offering, she said, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. Gray looked at her then. He really looked at her, and in the dim, smoky light of the cabin, he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The grief was still there, the pain was still there, but now it was forged into something new. Purpose, a deadly, razor-sharp focus, the kind that comes when a person finally finds something worth fighting for again, even if that something is just the right to choose the manner of their own death. He saw the warrior Nalish had married. All right, he said, a grim nod. On my count of 3. You take the 2 on the left. I'll handle the others. Wait! Ayana's hand shot out, her fingers closing around his arm. The touch was warm, solid, a strange point of connection in the chaos. If we don't make it, if this goes badly, it won't, he said, his voice a low growl of certainty. But if it does, she insisted, her dark eyes searching his face, pleading with him to understand. I want you to know, I'm glad you weren't what I expected. Gray's callous thumb gently brushed the line of her cheek, wiping away a single tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. Me too. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass, a whole lifetime of what-ifs packed into a single heartbeat. Then the first gunshot shattered the night, and the world exploded into fire and noise. Instinct took over. The front window of the cabin imploded, glass showering inwards as Ayana's Winchester roared. The first raider outside was thrown from his saddle, his torch tumbling into the dry pine needles piled up against the cabin wall. Orange flames immediately licked up the dry wood, casting a hellish, dancing light across the snow. As the first man dropped, Gray's Colt barked twice. 2 neat holes appeared in the center of the second man's chest, and he crumpled without a sound. But the other 2 were smart. They had flanked wide, using the initial chaos as cover. Behind you! Ayana screamed, but it was too late. The back door crashed open, splintered wood flying, and the third raider stormed in. Gray spun, his Colt blazing, but the raider's shot was a fraction of a second faster. A sledgehammer of force slammed into Gray's left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. The Winchester roared again, its sound deafening inside the small cabin. The third raider's head snapped back with a sickening crack, and he collapsed in a heap next to the overturned table. Ayana worked the lever action, a hot brass casing spinning through the smoky air, but the fourth and final man was already inside. He dove low as her next shot splintered the log wall just above his head. He was on her before she could chamber another round, tackling her hard to the floor. The rifle skittered away across the rough boards, lost in the shadows. Huge, filthy hands closed around her throat, squeezing the air from her lungs. She looked up into a pair of pale, bloodshot eyes and saw her own death reflected there. Pretty little thing, the man grunted, his breath hot and foul on her face. Gonna have me some fun before... He never finished the sentence. Ayana's right hand, which had been pinned beneath him, was now free, and in it she still held the obsidian blade. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she drove the knife deep into his side, just below the ribs, angling the tip up toward his heart, just like Nalish had taught her so many years ago. A look of shocked surprise crossed his face. His grip on her throat loosened. He made a wet gurgling sound, and then his entire weight collapsed on top of her, hot, sticky blood spreading in a dark stain across her buckskin dress. Silence fell like a heavy blanket, a sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the hungry crackle of the spreading flames and Gray's harsh, labored breathing. Ayanna shoved the dead weight of the man off her, gasping for air, her whole body trembling with adrenaline. She scrambled to her feet, wiping the blood from her sacred blade on the dead man's shirt. Across the rapidly filling room of smoke, Gray was struggling to stand, his left arm hanging limp and useless at his side, a crimson stain spreading rapidly down his shirt. "You're hit," she said, her voice raspy. She moved to his side without thinking, her hands hovering over his shoulder. "Bad." "Seen worse," he grunted, but his face was chalk white, his skin clammy with shock. He was losing a lot of blood. "We need to get out of here," she urged, her eyes darting around the room. The fire, fed by the dry wood and the howling wind, was spreading with terrifying speed. Flames were already climbing the eastern wall, licking at the ceiling beams. The air was thick with choking smoke, the sharp, acrid scent of burning pine. In another minute, the whole cabin would be a funeral pyre. Gray took a step toward his fallen rifle, then stumbled, his legs buckling. Ayanna caught him, his dead weight surprisingly heavy against her smaller frame. She wrapped his good arm around her shoulders, her own arm circling his waist to support him. For a moment they stood there, pressed together in the heart of the inferno, two enemies turned allies, clinging to each other for survival. "The canyon," he gasped, his voice weak. "The back window. It's the only way out." They staggered through the smoke and heat, reaching the back window just as the roof began to groan under the strain of the fire. Gray looked down at the 30-foot drop, at the jagged rocks and deep shadows below, then looked at his shattered shoulder. "I can't climb down," he said, shaking his head. "Not one-handed. I'll fall." "Then we jump," she said, her voice ringing with a strange, wild certainty. "You'll break your neck." A humorless laugh escaped Ayanna's lips. "I came here to die tonight anyway," she said, her eyes glittering in the firelight. "At least this way, I get to choose how." She didn't wait for his reply. She helped him through the shattered window frame, then quickly followed, the heat of the fire scorching their backs. They hung there for a heartbeat, side by side, their fingertips digging into the rough wood of the sill as the flames roared behind them, a dragon's breath at their heels. The canyon floor looked impossibly far away, a landscape of unforgiving stone. "Together?" Gray asked, his voice strained. "Together," she answered, and they let go. The impact knocked the wind clean out of both of them. Ayanna tucked and rolled instinctively, the tough buckskin tearing on sharp stone. But she came up bruised and battered, but whole. Gray wasn't so lucky. He landed hard on his wounded side, the shock of the impact tearing a raw curse from his lips. He lay crumpled on the ground, groaning in pain. Above them, the cabin burned like a great orange torch against the star-dusted velvet of the night sky. A funeral pyre for the life Gray had built there, and for the simple revenge Ayanna had sought. They lay there for a long moment in the cold, silent bottom of the canyon, gasping for air, hearts hammering against their ribs, alive against all possible odds. When Ayanna finally managed to push herself into a sitting position, she found Gray watching her, his face pale with pain, but with an expression of something that looked like pure wonder in his eyes. "You saved my life," he rasped. "You saved mine first," she replied, the simple truth of it settling between them, as real and solid as the cold rock beneath them. An hour ago, they had been hunter and prey, executioner and victim. Now, now they were something else entirely. Two survivors bound together by blood and fire in a night of impossible violence. Two people who had faced death side by side and, in the process, had found something new and terrifying and undeniable to live for. Gray's cabin was gone, a heap of glowing embers by the time they found their feet. But he told her he kept a small line shack further up the canyon, a tiny one-room shelter he used during winter storms to check on his traps. Leaning on each other, they began the slow, painful journey through the darkness. His good arm was draped over her shoulders, her body a warm, solid presence against his side, supporting him, guiding him. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had just happened. The shack was little more than a box made of rough-sawn planks, but it was shelter from the wind, and it was stocked with the essentials. A few dusty blankets, a small stove, and a flask of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. By the flickering golden light of a single oil lamp, Ayana tended to his wound. She cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt with the obsidian knife. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, missing the bone. A miracle of dumb luck. Still, it was a nasty, ragged wound. Her touch was surprisingly gentle as she cleaned it with whiskey, her movements efficient and sure. He watched her face in the warm glow, mesmerized. He saw the intense concentration in her dark eyes, the way the tip of her tongue peeked out from between her lips as she worked. Using a needle and thread she pulled from a small pouch in her dress, she began to stitch the torn edges of his skin back together. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, when she was finally done wrapping the wound with a strip of clean cloth. "Why are you helping me?" Ayana's hand stilled on the bandage. She didn't look at him. She stared at her own handiwork, at the neat, clean dressing on the shoulder of the man she had come to kill. "Because when those men came," she said softly, "when they threatened me, you stood between us. You armed me. You were willing to die to protect me, even knowing I had come here to take your life. And the revenge?" He pressed gently. "For your husband?" She was quiet for so long that he thought she wasn't going to answer. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the lamp and the fading howl of the wind outside. Through the shack's single small window, they could see the last orange glow of his burning cabin, a dying ember on the horizon. "Nellis used to say that hatred is like holding a hot coal in your hand," she said, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it. "You want to throw it at your enemy, but you're the one who gets burned. It hurts you more than it ever hurts them." She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, luminous in the lamplight, met his. "I have been carrying that hot coal in my heart for 8 months, Gray. Tonight, for the first time, I felt it finally go cold." His good hand, the right one, found hers, his calloused, rough fingers gently intertwined with her smooth bronze skin. The simple touch felt more intimate than any kiss. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know," she confessed, and the honesty of it, the uncertainty, seemed to frighten her. "I have lived for revenge for so long. I don't know what a life without it even looks like. I don't know who I am if I'm not his widow, seeking justice for his death." "You're Ayana," he said, his voice soft but firm. His thumb traced a slow circle across the back of her hand. "The woman who saved my life. The woman who fought like a she-lion. The woman who is sitting here with me now, when she could be anywhere else in this world." Something inside her chest, something that had been frozen solid for months, began to crack. Not the sharp, painful crack of more damage, but the gentle, hopeful splitting of a seed getting ready to bloom. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his uninjured shoulder, breathing in the scent of him. Wood smoke, whiskey, and sweat. A strangely comforting smell. "I can't stay," she whispered, the words a painful admission. "My people, if they knew I was here, with you—" "I know," he murmured, his lips brushing against the crown of her head, the kiss as soft and gentle as a prayer. "I would never ask you to choose between your world and mine." But when she lifted her face to look at him, her eyes mere inches from his, he saw his own desperate loneliness, his own profound hunger, reflected back at him in their dark depths. It was the raw, undeniable need for connection, for a human touch, for another soul who understood the crushing weight of loss and the brutal price of survival. She kissed him first. It was a tentative, questioning kiss, like a woman learning to trust again after a lifetime of betrayal. He responded with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, his good hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the proud, high line of her cheekbone. The kiss deepened, slowly at first, Then with a sudden, desperate urgency, it became something raw and necessary, not a kiss of passion, but of healing. It was the joining of two broken people, trying to find the missing pieces of their souls in each other. When they made love, it was with the quiet, desperate intensity of two people who had found each other on the very edge of the world, knowing their time was short. In the golden lamplight, her skin was silk and shadow, his touch almost reverent as he explored the curves and hollows of her body. They moved together with a tender, unspoken understanding, finding a temporary solace, a brief moment of peace in each other's arms. They weren't a soldier and a widow. They weren't white and Apache. They were just a man and a woman, two broken things creating a fleeting, beautiful moment of wholeness in the heart of the wilderness. Afterward, she lay curled against his side, her head resting on his chest, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a sound that was more comforting than any words could ever be. Through the small window, the first pale gray fingers of dawn were beginning to touch the jagged peaks of the eastern mountains. "I have to go," she said into his chest, her voice muffled. "I know," he replied, but for a long time neither of them moved. Neither of They lay wrapped together as the sky slowly lightened from gray to pink to gold, watching the world wake up around them, memorizing the feel of skin against skin, the sound of their synchronized breathing, trying to burn this one impossible night into their memories forever. When she finally did rise and begin to dress, he didn't try to stop her. He just watched her, propped up on his good elbow as she braided her long black hair, her movements fluid and graceful and sure. Before she left, she walked to the small table and placed the obsidian blade next to the guttering oil lamp. She didn't leave it as a threat. She left it as a memory, a testament to the night the hatred had finally died. "Will I see you again?" he asked, the question he'd been holding back, the one that felt like a lead weight in his chest. Ayana paused at the door, her hand resting on the rough, splintered wood. She looked back at him over her shoulder. "In another life, perhaps," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "A life where there is no blood between our peoples, where the world is kinder than this one. And in this life," he whispered. She turned back to face him fully one last time, and in the growing light of the new day, he saw the silver tracks of fresh tears on her cheeks. "In this life," she said, her voice breaking on the last word, "we had one night, and sometimes that has to be enough." The door closed behind her with a soft final click. Gray lay there, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading away, then the faint sound of her horse moving up the canyon trail, away from him, back to her own world. When a deep, profound silence settled over the shack once more, he slowly, painfully, rose from the cot and went to the window. She was already gone, vanished into the morning mist like a dream he might have half remembered upon waking. On the table, the obsidian blade caught the first rays of the rising sun, the black volcanic glass gleaming as if lit from within. It was no longer a weapon of vengeance. It was a promise that even the deepest wounds could heal, a promise that even the bitterest of enemies could find peace, and a promise that sometimes, against all odds, love could bloom in the most barren and unlikely of ground. Gray picked up the knife, the stone cool and smooth against his skin. He ran his thumb carefully along the razor-sharp edge. The thin cut on his throat from the night before had already begun to scab over, a tiny scar he would carry for the rest of his days. But this night, this woman, this impossible connection, this would leave a different kind of scar. The kind a man carried deep inside his heart, a mark that was warm as whiskey on a cold night, a memory that would keep him company through all the long, lonely years to come. If this story from the untamed frontier moved you, where hearts can collide and destinies can be changed in a single night, let us know by hitting that like button and subscribing for more tales of the wilder corners of the human heart. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. We love hearing from all the fellow travelers on this journey.